It's been a while, so I thought I would actually do up a video on neonatal fluid management because why not? Grab a piece of paper and let's go. Hello and welcome to MK's Medical Review Series. My name is Dr. Moses Kazevu. This is a series on my YouTube channel where we look at medical topics in depth. Today we're going to look at neonatal fluid management. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon to be receiving notification of such videos every time I post. Tell a friend to tell a friend. We are back on the channel. I know I say this all the time, but I promise now we are back on the channel. And grab a piece of paper and your pen and let's go. So remember that disorders of fluid as well as electrolyte imbalance are very, very common among unwell neonates, whether they are term neonates or whether they are preterm neonates. If you don't understand some of these terms, don't worry. I'm going to actually explain them very, very shortly. And remember that water is life. It's very, very important that each and every single individual actually receives water because the bulk majority of the body is made out of water. And remember that in the preterm neonates, they have a total body water that's consisting about 90% of their body weight, whilst in the term neonates, it's about 75% of their weight. So this is actually a very, very important concept to actually understand because in the preterm neonates, they tend to actually have greater water losses because their skin is immature. They have a lot of insensible losses, which are these losses that you can't really control. Losses from the mucosa, losses from the skin, losses from the GIT, as well as the respiratory system. So water is actually a primary need in the first 24 to 48 hours because there is something that's known as physiologic diuresis. And remember, for all children that are below 6 months, we never give them plain water. I repeat, we never give them plain water. Why don't we give them this? Remember that their kidneys are not well developed. They're not well matured. Their glomerular filtration rate is very low. They have reduced proximal and distal tubular reabsorption of sodium. So if you give them a lot of water, you run the risk of actually diluting the sodium that is present in their body and causing hyponatremia, which can cause a lot of problems in this child. It can actually even lead to convulsions. So please do not give water to a child that's below 6 months. Now remember that the neonates actually are born with excessive total body water, and this is primarily in the extracellular compartment. Let me track back a little bit. So remember that water is divided into two main compartments. There's what is known as the ICF, which is the intracellular compartment, and there's what is known as the ECF, which is the extracellular compartment. So the ICF, or the intracellular compartment, is the water that you find within the cells. Then the ECF is what you find outside the cells. Remember that blood is also found in the extracellular compartment. You have blood, you have fluid that's found in the joints, you have pretty much tissue fluid or interstitial fluid. So this extracellular fluid is the one that's going to be lost. So remember that the total body water that's lost, the excess total body water, is going to be lost by diuresis in the first week of life. So it means that we generally do expect a child to lose weight during the first week of life, but they're not supposed to lose excessive weight. But we generally are going to see that they're going to lose some weight. So there is some expected early postnatal weight loss, and it's actually much higher in the preterm infants. And in the preterm infants, it can actually be as high as 15% of their body weight. So in the term neonates, they lose about 7 to 10% of their body weight, so which is roughly about 1 to 3% per day. And this is in the first 3 to 5 days of life. Then in the preterm infants, which is a bit higher, 2 to 3%, they lose about 10 to 15%. So if a child is losing more than 3% in a day of their body weight, that's already a red flag to you. So remember that the water is going to be lost, like I said, through the skin, through the respiratory system. We refer to these as insensible water losses because you can't really control them. And it's much higher in the preterm infants because they have thinner skins. And of course, the preterm infants are much smaller, so it means that they have a greater surface area. So with a greater surface area means that there's greater evaporation happening, there's greater loss of water through the skin. So remember that fever, increased respiratory rate, radiant warmers, and even phototherapy can increase the insensible losses. So therefore, if a child is on phototherapy, you want to increase the fluid intake to about 10 to 20 mils per kg per day in those neonates. So you may also have neonates that have hyaline membrane disease, and this is also actually associated with delayed postnatal diuresis. They may also be transdermal water losses, which are much higher in very preterm infants. I'll explain all these terms very, very shortly. If you have no idea what a neonate is, no idea what a preterm infant is, or a very preterm infant is, I will explain them very shortly. Just hang on to the video. Do not go away. So a healthy baby that's greater than 1,200 grams should be started on enteral feeding with breast milk. Then a baby that's greater than 1,800 grams who's able to breastfeed directly actually should breastfeed directly, whilst the smaller babies may actually require expressed breast milk and may be fed by other suitable alternative routes. So remember that the IV fluids are indicated for all sick children, all children that are going to be weighing less than 1.2 kg, all children that have a gestational age that is less than 30 weeks should be started on IV fluids routinely. And remember that the sick babies, irrespective of their weight, irrespective of their gestational age, those that have conditions such as respiratory distress, significant asphyxia, those that have feed intolerance, hemodynamic instability, GIT malformations, tracheoesophageal fistulas, intestinal atresias, or any other severely ill child or any illness that can preclude the ability of the child to feed orally, you should give this children IV fluid. So in short, all the sick children must be given IV fluid, because remember, when a child is sick, they may not really breastfeed so well. And especially in mothers who can't really produce so much milk, you also want to put the child on IV fluids. So all infants that are less than 30 weeks gestational age or 1,200 grams must be placed in a plastic bag at delivery without drying them and leave their face exposed. So the weight should actually be monitored daily. Then we should cover all infants less than 30 weeks and less than 1,200 grams under a radiant heater with a clear plastic bag. So here are the terms, and I want you to pay close attention. So remember that the average birth weight that the child is supposed to be born with is a range between 2.5 to 3.5 kilograms. So the average is going to be about 3 kilograms. And babies that are born between 1,500 to 2,500, we refer to this as low birth weight. So the actual values actually here goes to 2,499, but I know that's a bit tricky for some of you to remember. Then the babies that are born between 1,000 to 1,500, we refer to these as very low birth weight. Then those that are less than 1,000 grams, we refer to this as extremely low birth weight. So a neonate is pretty much a child that's less than 28 days of life. A term infant, or a term neonate rather, is a baby that's born after 37 completed weeks of gestation. Preterm if they are born before 37 weeks of completed gestation. Late preterm if they are born between 32 weeks to 36 weeks plus 6 days of gestation. Then very preterm if they are between 28 weeks to 31 weeks plus 6 days of completed gestation. And then extremely preterm if they're less than 28 weeks of gestation. Remember that the younger the child is born, the greater the risk of the child not surviving, meaning that there are going to be a lot of complications that are associated with prematurity. Things like respiratory distress, they may develop other complications of prematurity such as intraventricular hemorrhage, so on and so forth. So, fluids. How do we calculate them? This is pretty much based on 3 important things. It's based on the birth weight of the child, the gestational age plus the corrected age. It's based on the day of life, whether they're on day 1, day 2, day 3, or day 4. And it's based on the current fluid balance. How much fluid have you given? What's the output from this child? How many nappies have been changed from this child? So I hope you keep this in mind. This is very important for you to know. So I'll divide it into 2 groups. Those that are greater than 1,500 grams, those that are less than 1,500 grams. So greater than 1.5 kg, less than 1.5 kg. We'll start with the ones that are greater than 1.5 kg. So initially, you're going to be starting it at a rate of 60 to 80 mils per kg per day. Now, remember that there are certain conditions where you don't want to give this full 60 to 80 mils per kg per day because you don't want to, number 1, overload the child with fluids. Number 2, you don't want to cause excess fluid in the body, because some children may have what is known as a syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretions. Children that have CNS pathologies, children that have respiratory pathologies, you generally want to avoid overloading them with fluid. So you generally could give them 2/3 of this. But all other children that have no contraindication, you can give them the full allocation of these fluids. And remember that this is not something that is set in stone, as in something that works for every other child. Fluid management must be individualized to each and every single child. So you should be doing the calculations every day, and you should be considering a number of things that I will talk about. So these children that are greater than 1.5 kg should ideally be started on 10% dextrose without any electrolytes. And remember when to keep the glucose rate between 4 to 6 milligrams per kg per minute. And remember that as this infant begins to grow and receive these enteral feeds, the solute load actually to the kidneys is also supposed to increase. So remember, this infant requires more fluid to actually excrete these solutes, and so water is required for the fecal losses and also for growth purposes. Now remember that we're starting with 60 to 80 mils per kg per day. I'll give you an example to explain all this. And these fluid requirements are supposed to be increased by increments of 15 to 20 mils per kg per day to reach a maximum of 150 mils per kg per day on day 7, moving onwards. And remember that sodium and potassium should be added to the IV fluids after 48 hours. So meaning in the first 2 days, we're just going to be keeping this child on 10% dextrose. Then after 48 hours, we're going to be switching them now to quarter strength Dara solution with 10% dextrose. So we can now add the sodium, we can now add the potassium. Here's an example. So suppose a child is weighing 1,800 grams, and we want to use kilograms because the formula is giving us actually the formula is in mils per kg, so it's not in mils per gram. So we want to change this to kilograms. So if you want to change this to kilograms, you divide it by 1,000. So we're going to have 1.8 kilograms. So on day 1, let's say where you were starting at 60 mils per kg per day. So 60 mils multiplied by the weight of the child, which is 1.8. So this will give you 108 mils. So it means in 24 hours, this child must receive a total fluid intake of 108. If the child is not breastfeeding at all, then this 108 is completely going to be placed as IV. But if the child is breastfeeding, you want to also subtract the amount of breast milk that you're going to be giving from this total fluid that you're going to be giving this child to avoid overloading the child with fluid. So how are you going to give this 108 mils? So it's a bit difficult if you just write this 108 mils in 24 hours as an order. So you want to divide it into small aliquots that are going to be easier to give, especially for the nurse that's working on the ward. So remember that there are 24 hours in a day, right? So if you want to calculate how much fluid you're going to be giving per hour, you divide this 104 divided by 24. So it means that you're going to be giving 4.5 mils per hour. So it means in 1 hour, this child should receive about 4.5 mils per hour. Then if you want to give it in 8 hours or over 8 hours, you multiply it by 8. You put this 4.5 by 8. So this gives you 36 mils every 8 hours. So within 8 hours, they should receive 36 mils. So if you calculate 36 mils by 3, it should give you back to roughly around 108 as in 24 hours, because there are 3 8 hours in 24 hours. I hope that makes sense. So this is what's going to be on day 1. So your orders that you're going to be writing in your files is that this child should receive 36 mils of 10% dextrose every 8 hours or over 8 hours. Then on day 2, remember that we're going to be increasing by about 15 to 20 mils per kg. So in this case, I use 20 mils per kg. But remember, these increments that you're making, you should also consider certain things. You should consider how much fluid has this child received? What condition is this child having? Is this child's output matching the input? Generally, if there is a big deficit, let's say if this child is receiving 108 and hasn't passed a lot of urine, hasn't changed a lot of nappies, it means that you're lagging behind on the fluid. So it means that the increase in the number of fluids must be much better. So if on day 2 you have increased this to 80 mils, now I've increased from 60 mils per kg per day to 80 mils per kg per day. So in this case, you're going to say 80 multiplied by the weight of the child. Let's say it's 1.8, so that gives you 144 mils. But remember, you're going to be weighing this child each and every single day. So 144 mils in 24 hours. And if you want to give this per hour, you can divide this by 24. So that's going to be 6 mils per hour. hour. Then if you want to actually give it over 8 hours, you multiply this by 8. So that's 48 mils in 8 hours. Then, so that's a child that's above 1.5 kg. Now, what if this child is actually below 1.5 kg or 1,500 grams? So remember that the urine output is similar to the baby that is actually 1,500 grams or more. However, the insensible losses in this case are much higher. Why is this so? Number one, the child is smaller, so it means that there is an increased surface area and there is greater losses in this child. So it means that generally you're going to want to start at a higher fluid level in a child that is much smaller. So it means that your initial fluid is going to be given at 80 mils per kg per day. And remember, we are starting with 10% dextrose. This is on day 1. And remember that the baby should be well dressed, including provisions of caps and socks to reduce the insensible water losses under the radiant warmer. And then as the skin matures, remember that the insensible losses are progressively going to decrease, and therefore the fluid requirements become similar to those of a bigger baby. So we're going to be increasing the fluids by about 10 to 15 mils per kg per day in this case, until we reach a maximum of about 150 mils per kg per day by either day 5 to day 7. And just like with the children that are greater than 1,500 grams, we want to start with the sodium and potassium IV fluids after 48 hours. And here's a very, very important thing. For those that are extremely low birth weight, those that are less than 1,000 grams, the extremely low birth weight children, we want to start them on 5% dextrose as opposed to 10% dextrose. So here's an example. So a child that's weighing 1,250 grams, remember if we change this to kilograms, it's going to be 1.2 kilograms. We multiply that by 80, that gives us 100 mils. So this child should receive 4.2 mils per hour, and they should receive 33 mils over 8 hourly. So you want to, whichever one you want to use as an order. Then on the second day, if we increase this by 15, they get up to 95, multiplied by 1.25, that gives us 120 mils in a day. Then the infusion is going to be at 5 mils per hour, and then that's about 40 mils 8 hourly. If you have an infusion pump, you can actually enter these into the infusion pump, and it's very, very good. But if you have the burette, you have to titrate it and using the drops per minute. So here is a table to summarize everything that I've been talking about. So those that are less than 1,000 grams, the extremely low birth weight, you give them a 5%. Those that are very low birth weight, 1,000 to 1,199, you give them 10% dextrose. Those that are 1,200 to 1,499, you give them 10% dextrose. Those that are greater than 1,500, 10% dextrose. And this is what we're starting with on day 1. 90 mils per kg for this group, 80 mils per kg per day for that group, 70 mils per kg per day for that group, 60 mils per kg per day for that group. Remember, as the baby is getting bigger, the surface area is also reducing, so it means that even the fluid requirements are reducing. Then the glucose is going to be at 3.2 milligrams per kg per minute, 5.6, 4.2, 4.2. So as the baby is getting bigger, then even the amount of glucose that they need is actually also increasing. So here's just an estimate of the total fluid that they should receive in a day. Those that are less than 1,500, those that are greater than 1,500. About 80 mils per kg per day over day 1, 95 mils per kg per day over day 1, but eventually we should all reach 150 mils per kg per day by day 7. So you can actually pause the video at this moment, get a screenshot of this. It may actually help you. So how do we monitor these children? So remember that monitoring should be done every 12 to 24 hours. And clinically, it's not useful to rely on the signs of dehydration. Remember, your sunken eyes, your poor skin turgor, they're not so reliable in neonates. So one thing that can actually be reliable is the urine output in the neonates. You can actually check the capillary refill time. You can check the pulses. Those are actually quite reliable signs. And remember that if an infant actually loses 10% of their body weight, or they are 10% dehydrated, then they may have sunken eyes and the fontanelle that's sunken. They may have cold, clammy skin. They may have poor skin turgor and oliguria. Those that have lost more than 15% of their body weight, these may actually be in shock. So they may be hypotension, they may be tachycardia, they may be weak pulses. And remember that the urine output, roughly by day 3, should be about 1 to 3 mils per kg per hour. But of course, this is very difficult to quantify unless if you have a urine collector that is collected, or if this child is catheterized. But if you actually have time, you can actually squeeze the nappies and actually quantify the amount of fluid that is being lost is urine. And remember that for the body weight, you must take serial measurements, and these should be used to estimate the fluid deficit in the neonates. So remember that the term neonates, like I said, lose 1 to 3% of their body weight per day, which has a cumulative loss of 5 to 10% in the first week. The preterm neonates is about 2 to 3%, and this is a cumulative loss of about 10 to 15% in the first week. So remember that failure of loss of this weight in the first week is a red flag, because this may mean that there's excessive fluid overload. And then again, excessive loss, meaning greater than 3% in 24 hours or in the first 5 to 7 days, this actually is not physiological, and this means that the child, this should be corrected. There's a problem. So things that you should keep note before I end this video, you should actually keep note that the blood glucose must be maintained between 2.6 and 7 millimoles. Generally, if the blood glucose is less than 3 millimoles, we want to treat the hypoglycemia. So we want to give them 3 mils per kg of 10% dextrose. Then actually we can change them to an infusion of 10% dextrose. So remember, if a child is weighing, let's say 2 kilograms, so it's going to be 2 multiplied by 3, so that's going to be 6 mils. So you're going to give them a bolus of 6 mils of 10% dextrose. Then of course the increments are going to be 10 to 20 mils per kg and depend on certain things. They depend on the urine output, like I said, they depend on the weight of the child, they depend on the serum sodium. So also do not forget that you have to subtract the breast fluid volume, the breastfeed, or the milk that the child is taking, subtracted from the total fluid intake. Then after 36 to 48 hours, we change to 5% dextrose, or we can change the 5% dextrose to a quarter strength Diros solution and 10% dextrose, depending on the blood glucose level. We want to avoid oliguria, which is less than 0.5 mils per kg per day. But remember, this is very difficult to quantify, especially if the child is changing or is having nappies, is not catheterized, it doesn't have a urine collector. So a good way to indicate this is how many times the mother has actually changed the diaper. Greater than 6 changes in a day, that's actually a very good estimate that the urine output is actually very good. So generally you want to keep it, you want to aim for 0.5 to 1 mil per kg per hour. So we keep the urine output actually greater than 1 mil per kg per hour if it's an ideal setting. So we want to keep the sodium between 135 to 145, the potassium between 4 to 5, the chloride between 98 to 108. We keep them in these levels to prevent certain complications that may arise due to electrolyte imbalance. We want to monitor the weight. Like I said, excessive changes in the weight may actually represent rapid changes in the fluid status, and the weight loss greater than 10% of the birth weight is actually of great concern. So 5% is actually suitable for extremely low birth weight infants, because it has a low solid load and their kidneys are actually quite immature for them to handle this solid load that 10% dextrose would actually give. And remember, we also want to keep into consideration the thermal energy requirements. So for a full-term infant, they require about 60 to 80 kilocalories per kg per day in the first week, and thereafter 80 to 120 kilocalories per kg per day. Then the preterm are going to be requiring slightly less, so about 50 to about 90 kilocalories per kg per day in the first week, and thereafter they may actually require 100 to 150 kilocalories per day. So in the long run, they do require much more kilocalories because they are actually trying to catch up to their older counterparts. I will do another video to talk about the breast milk calculations, the calorie calculations. So please stay tuned to the channel. Keep your eyes peeled. If you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe. Thank you for actually spending your time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button. It does help the channel grow. Consider subscribing too. Leave a comment if you may. To Zambia and beyond, my name is Dr. Moses Kazevu. Until next time, bye-bye.